gets essentially absolute power, and they jam something down your throat. And I remember what they jammed down our throat, which was Obamacare. And had Republicans and Democrats been willing during the Bush years to compromise on some healthcare solutions or some healthcare policy, we probably wouldn't have gotten Obamacare. And now we're at the point where we were not willing to compromise, I think, as a community, as a party, as a movement, and we got Obamacare, and now we're probably moving even closer and closer to getting single payer because we can't even agree to compromise on dealing with elements of Obamacare. So compromising on basic principles, that's, that would take 3 hours to discuss in full, but I think most everything has to be on the table for compromise, or you get to the point where the imposition of bad policy is made by our elected officials.
People who look at this very closely, such as Michael Barone and others, say throughout the sweep of American history, there's a clear tendency towards having, in our stultified two-party system, there's a majority party and a minority party at any given moment. And the majority party gets about 80% of what it wants over time. And the minority party gets about 20%. Your job in politics is to win enough elections that you get to be the majority party. Then the compromise becomes on your terms. And I think what Brian is saying probably is very accurate when it comes to the California state legislature and other political dynamics, but in the Congress of the United States with Obamacare, which I covered in 2009 and 2010, the Democrats were not interested in compromise. They really weren't. They wanted a few Vichy French collaborators. But really, they wanted to pass single payer, and it was Democrats who basically blocked them from doing that. Now, in theory, you could argue that during the Bush years, there should have been a compromise in health care that would have been less onerous to the American economy. But in reality, that was a failure of the Republicans because their constituents in the insurance companies, which basically try to buy, rent, or lease both political parties, didn't want to make changes. They were happy to make profits as it was, and they got a better offer from the Democrats, and they sold out to the Democrats. So compromise, in theory, is a plausible thing, but it depends where the special interests are, depends where the money is, depends where each political party is, and what especially it depends on is, are you the majority party? Because if you're the majority party, your willingness to really compromise and anything around the edges is very limited because you are the majority and you can pass it.
One thing, I mean, we're talking about, I guess, we're at a libertarian conference, so to speak, and I think everybody in the room presumably believes in free markets. So I guess the point I wanted to make to Brian was when you're talking about, they weren't willing to compromise back then, so now it's reached critical mass. We lost the battle on everything in regards to free markets as soon as you concede that the government should be able to regulate anything. So that was my point of this session. Part of it was to identify, as soon as you cede that, you make that first basic compromise that, well, we're supposed to be a free market, but the government has the right to tell me how much I should pay someone. Now you've just opened Pandora's box, and it's strictly a matter of, like you said, cycle after cycle, they just keep piling on, and that's what we keep seeing in all of these different industries. The most successful industries have no regulation. There's no, government controls there. So to me, as soon as you open that door, that's where the bad.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that. My issue is this: is that even prior to the passage of Obamacare, we already had government in the healthcare system, and Republicans were soundly in support of healthcare in the government system. So my attitude is that to change that, which is a whole different conversation, you have to start persuading the public and going directly to the public. I think the way you build credibility with the public is that you start tinkering within what you can change through compromise, and then you don't get the reputation or the brand that the Republican Party can't do anything, or the Republican Party is the party of no. And I think that's been, at least from what I see and read, and when we do our polling and whatnot, that's what we see even across the nation. I mean, it's very, very, very prominent in California because the California Republican Party basically did that, and now it's dead. But we'll maybe someday resurge. But without offering any solutions within the context of the debate, I think we hurt ourselves.
Yeah. If I could give a couple of examples, because when we're talking just in theory, everybody can take this idea to 1982, Reagan agreed to raise taxes $1 for every $3 he was promised in spending cuts by the Democrats. Now, the tax increase, as soon as it passed, was permanent, beginning the moment it passed. The tax increases, the spending cuts were promised that future, like next year and the year after and the year after, next 5 years, there would be the Appropriations Committee, the people who arranged to spend all of the money we're spending now, and who didn't cut spending last year or the year before will now cut spending $3 for $1. And Reagan agreed to that. He had a Democratic House that wasn't with him and a Republican majority Senate, but a pre-Reagan Republican majority run by Bob Dole, who had become a Republican because there were more Republicans than Democrats in his county in Kansas, and Kansas was Republican because they were with the North in the Civil War, and because Lincoln was a Republican, so they were, and it had nothing to do with taxes or spending or size of government. And of course, there was a compromise, but they gave up something. The Republicans Reagan gave up the tax increases in promise for somebody giving you something in the future that was not enforceable. So you could say that was a stupid compromise, but to the extent it was a stupid deal. It was a lousy deal. And it got taken. Spending went up, not down. Then Bush, but you could argue it was the first time he got cheated, or 8 years later, Bush was offered the same deal. $1 of tax increase for every $2 of imaginary spending cuts. I thought that was just cruel. I mean, you know, hey, you're a cheaper date, you get $2 of imaginary spending cuts. If you're going to cheat somebody, and since you're playing with Confederate money, you know, offer $10. You'll get $1 million of spending cuts. Why not? You know, you're not giving him any. And Bush signed on to that, which strikes me as not just stupid, but criminally stupid.
Cost of his presidency.
Yes, yes. He had an otherwise fairly successful presidency. As presidents go, there's the collapse of the Soviet Union, kicked Iraq out of Kuwait, and didn't occupy the place for 15 years. And, you know, pretty good presidency going, and one hole in the bottom of the boat that he shot. Both same, presidency same. And it wasn't as if it was his presidency. Reagan gave it to him. You're not supposed to total the car Dad gives you, right? And so you had those two examples. Now the left has been trying to come back and talk us into that every time. Let's do one of those grand bargains. Simpson-Bowles is that. A massive tax increase, about $5 trillion, in return for promises years from now of spending reduction, unstated. Okay? Simpson-Bowles, the only numbers in Simpson-Bowles are the size of the tax increase and the page numbers. There's no numbers on the spending cuts that you promised. And so the big deal is, we'll have a compromise, we'll raise taxes. Well, the reason they raise taxes is to spend the money. Why would they cut spending as part of the deal where you raise taxes? That doesn't make any sense by their own reasoning. But they keep offering that. And so in 2011, the Taxpayer Protection Pledge that we wrote, which is the terribly unreasonable thing, people sign a pledge to the American people, I promise not to vote for a tax increase. Full stop, pretty short thought. 2 witnesses, dated, we keep it in a closet somewhere, and not that we don't trust you, but we held people, Boehner, Mitch McConnell, the bulk of guys. We had a couple of people who'd have, Republican congressmen and senators, who'd have impure thoughts at moments and think maybe they could do a deal, but never enough of them to get traction. They'd be off on their own and they'd come back, and we held the line. No tax increase. Because of that, we got $2.5 trillion in spending restraint and a real law that limits spending with a sequester to back it up. And all the spending interests are very, very, very unhappy. But $2.5 trillion over a decade is pretty good spending limit. We kept being told, well, why don't you be reasonable and we'll have a little tax increase. A little tax increase as part of the deal. Right, we're just going to put one piranha in the goldfish bowl and we'll come back and count the goldfish later. If you put a tax increase on the table, it walks over and pushes all the spending cut discussion off the table. Because once you agree to the tax increase, the other team goes, well, we don't have to do these other spending cuts. We can do another tax increase because they're equatable. it was on that where the Republicans took the wholly unreasonable position against the President. The Republican House, Democrat Senate, Democrat President, were not. They knew he needed the debt ceiling increase because he was running for re-election. And he wasn't certain that if things went hooey that he would escape blame. He was willing to pay a very high ransom for debt ceiling to be increased, $2.5 trillion. So that was one where holding tight on taxes was important. The reason why I'm disappointed that Jeb Bush is the one Republican running for president who says, I won't sign the pledge and make a commitment, and has specifically said, I would raise taxes as part of the deal. Okay? He didn't pay attention. If my dad had thrown away a perfectly good presidency, I would have asked, I'd have learned from that, to do that. Nobody's life is a complete waste. Some people serve as bad examples. And if that's Dad's role in life, embrace it. Thanks, Dad. I won't do that.
And George W. Bush learned that.
George W. Bush did learn that. He didn't raise taxes, and he said, we're never raising taxes. He may invade countries he can't pronounce, but he wouldn't raise taxes. He did not make that mistake and got reelected for it as he governed. So sometimes the problem that Jeb has now in this is that it shows he's a lousy negotiator, right? That when you say we're not raising taxes, you force the other team to focus on spending restraint. If you say tax increases are available, you lose all effort to even have a conversation about reforming government. And that happens at the state level, at the local level, at the presidential level. So on the tax issue, staking out a no tax increase position, period, thank you very much, non-negotiable, is what works. Opening the door to negotiate on a little tax increase with spending and promises of spending cuts is we've done that twice, massive failure. The one time we said no tax increases, massive success, significant success. So that's, I think, an example of drawing the line and holding it.
And just briefly to add to